Did medieval women live lives totally shut away without any say, always oppressed? Were their worlds small and quiet, confined to the home from the moment they were born until their last breath between roughly 500 CE and 1500 CE? Let's peel back the layers of popular myths and uncover some truly surprising historical truths. Number 10, medieval clothing was solely restrictive and designed for male gaze. Many people think medieval women were just wrapped up in heavy, shapeless sacks, always uncomfortable, their clothes merely for covering up, or perhaps only made to please men looking at them. This idea misses so much of the creativity, the function, and the personal expression that was actually sewn into medieval garments. The truth is, women's clothing changed wildly across 1,000 years, region to region, and even from one social class to another. It was often incredibly practical, sometimes a display of wealth and status, and certainly not always about being purely restrictive or appealing to someone else's eyes. Think about the working woman in the countryside. A peasant woman certainly was not wearing a restrictive gown. Her clothing had to allow her to work in the fields, gather firewood, milk cows, and tend to a garden. She would wear simple tunics, sometimes made of wool or linen, that allowed for freedom of movement. These were practical garments, often layered for warmth, that were durable and suited to a life of physical labor. They were designed for movement and warmth, not for showing off a tiny waist or alluring curves. The shape was often loose and functional, allowing her to bend, stoop, and lift without hindrance. Her everyday wear was a uniform of utility, reflecting the demands of her daily life, which was far from a dainty, idle existence. Now, shift your focus to the urban centers, to the women involved in crafts and trade. A female brewer, a baker, or a dyer, all of whom were common figures in medieval towns, also needed practical attire. Their tunics and overgowns, often called e-coats or zesser would be durable, perhaps made of sturdier wool and designed to protect their regular clothes from the grime and demands of their work. A woman selling goods in the market might wear an apron over her clothes, a practical layer for protection and cleanliness, much like modern workwear. These were not items designed for aesthetic appeal, but for doing a job effectively. The layers and cuts were about keeping warm, staying clean, and moving easily through busy streets and workshops. Even among the wealthy, the clothing, while certainly more elaborate and costly, had its own functions beyond just decoration. The long gowns worn by noblewomen, often seen in illuminated manuscripts, were indeed full and flowing. But they were made from rich fabrics like silk, velvet, and brocade, often lined with fur for warmth and drafty castles. These garments were heavy, yes, but they were also a statement of status and power. The fabric itself, the dyes, and the intricate embroidery all spoke volumes about a family's wealth and connections. A particularly fashionable cotardi in the 14th century might have buttons all the way down the front, a detail that was both decorative and functional, allowing the garment to be fitted more closely to the body. This fit was a mark of contemporary style, not necessarily a restriction imposed by men, but a trend followed by women themselves. Headwear, too, was incredibly diverse and often practical. While the soaring chenin of the late medieval period could be a dramatic statement of fashion and social standing, many women wore simpler veils or coifs. These were often worn for modesty or religious reasons, but they also served a practical purpose, keeping hair clean, especially in dusty or smoky environments like kitchens or workshops. A simple linen coiffure could keep a woman's hair out of her face while she was cooking or spinning. The veils worn by married women in many regions were a sign of their status, but they also offered protection from the elements, much like a modern scarf. They were not always about concealing or being submissive, but about identifying oneself within a community and often about practical protection. Consider shoes. Medieval shoes were generally quite practical and durable, made of leather, often shaped to fit the foot quite well. Women needed shoes that could withstand walking on uneven ground, navigating muddy streets, or working for long hours. Footwear was rarely about delicate, restrictive fashion, but about protection and function. Even the long, pointed pulanes of the late medieval period, while a high fashion statement, were worn by both men and women, reflecting a general trend rather than something imposed on one gender. They were a sign of the times, a fleeting fashion that wasn't about restricting women, but about general style. Furthermore, medieval women were not passive recipients of fashion, they actively participated in its creation and dissemination. Female tailors, seamstresses, and embroiderers were skilled craftswomen, often organized into guilds, who designed and produced garments. They understood the needs and desires of their female clients. The trends in fashion, while influenced by broader societal norms and the patronage of royalty, also stemmed from the inventiveness and preferences of the women wearing them and the women making them. They were not merely dressing to be looked at, they were dressing for their lives, their comfort, their status, and sometimes for their own enjoyment of beauty and style. The choices in color, fabric, and adornment were often personal, reflecting individual tastes as much as societal expectation. Even something as seemingly simple as a girdle, often worn over an outer garment, served multiple purposes. It could cinch a loose tunic, creating a more fitted silhouette, which was a fashionable look in certain periods. But it also provided a place to hang useful items like a pouch, a key, or a set of rosary beads. This functionality made the girdle an essential accessory for many women, allowing them to keep necessary tools close at hand as they went about their daily tasks. It wasn't just a decorative belt, it was a practical toolkit worn around the waist. So, the notion that medieval clothing for women was always restrictive and primarily designed to be looked at by men is a clear oversimplification. While societal expectations and modesty norms played a role, just as they do today, the overwhelming evidence points to a diverse range of clothing that was functional, reflective of status, practical for work, and often a matter of personal choice and contemporary style, designed and made by women themselves. Their attire was a mirror of their active, varied lives, not a cage. Number 9. Women had no economic independence. The idea that medieval women were entirely dependent on men for their economic survival, always without their own money or property, is a narrative that fades away once you look closely at the historical records. Across the vast span of the Middle Ages, in towns and villages, in royal courts and peasant cottages, women found countless ways to earn their own keep, manage significant wealth, and operate thriving businesses, demonstrating a surprising degree of economic independence. Their contributions were often the backbone of family economies and sometimes even the wider community's prosperity. Let's start in the bustling medieval towns. The guilds, which were associations of craftsmen and merchants, often included women as members, sometimes even in leadership roles. Women were active in crafts like brewing, baking, textile production, and candle making. For instance, in cities like London and Paris, women ran successful breweries, producing and selling ale that was a staple drink for everyone. A woman could inherit her husband's business upon his death, but many women also started their own enterprises from scratch, particularly in trades where skills were learned within the household. The widow of a master craftsman often continued the business, maintaining apprentices and trading on her own account. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement, these women were recognized as legal individuals capable of conducting business. Consider the textile industry, which was a massive part of the medieval economy. Women were crucial at every stage, from spinning wool into thread to weaving it into cloth, and then dyeing and finishing it. They were often paid for their labor, contributing directly to household income or earning money for themselves. In places like Flanders and Italy, where the cloth trade boomed, female spinners and weavers were indispensable. Some women even became entrepreneurs in their own right, organizing production and selling finished textiles. These were not just domestic tasks, they were professional, paid occupations that gave women a financial stake. Moving to the countryside, peasant women also held significant economic roles. Sure, they worked alongside men in the fields, planting, harvesting, and threshing crops. They managed the dairy, caring for cows and goats, and producing cheese and butter, which were often sold at local markets, bringing in cash income for the family. They kept poultry, spun wool, and made clothes, all tasks that directly contributed to the household's self-sufficiency and economic viability. While their work might not have always been directly compensated with wages, it was indispensable to the economic unit of the family and often directly involved in the production of goods for sale or trade. A woman often controlled the small surplus goods, whether eggs, milk, or spun yarn, that could be bartered or sold for petty cash, giving her some financial autonomy. Legal frameworks in some regions also recognize women's property rights. In English common law, for example, a woman could hold property in her own right, particularly if she was a widow or a single woman. A widow might inherit a dower, which was a portion of her late husband's estate or income, ensuring her financial security. She could manage this property, lease it out, or dispose of it as she wished without needing male permission. This legal right provided a crucial foundation for economic independence, allowing women to maintain their status and sometimes considerable wealth after the death of their husbands. This dower right was not a charity, but a recognized legal entitlement, providing a significant safety net. Furthermore, noble women, especially those who were heads of households, wielded immense economic power. They managed vast estates, overseeing hundreds of tenants, agricultural production, and the collection of rents and dues. They often handled complex financial accounts, negotiated leases, and made decisions that affected the livelihoods of many. For instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, was a duchess in her own right before becoming queen, controlling vast lands and considerable wealth. Her economic power was fundamental to her political influence. Lesser noblewomen also managed their households, which were often large economic units, involving numerous servants, craftspeople, and extensive inventories of goods. They were the economic administrators of their personal domains. Even within marriage, a woman might have some economic agency, particularly through her papara or peculium, which was property or wealth that she brought into the marriage or acquired independently, and which remained her own. This could include gifts from her family, earnings from her own labor before marriage, or inherited jewels. While her husband might manage it, it was often understood to be her own, providing a measure of personal financial security. In some towns, particularly those with strong merchant communities, married women were recognized as femmes, souls, or femme sole traders under certain legal customs. This meant they could conduct business independently of their husbands, sue or be sued, and enter into contracts. This legal status was specifically designed to facilitate urban commerce and allowed married women to operate their own shops or trades without their husband's direct involvement, giving them significant economic freedom in the marketplace. Religious women in convents also operated within an economic framework that provided independence. Abbesses were often significant landowners, managing large estates and overseeing agricultural production, much like feudal lords. They controlled resources, supervised workers, and made financial decisions that affected the economic stability of their entire community. They were often powerful economic figures in their local regions, participating in markets, collecting rents, and investing in new construction or land improvements. The convent itself was an economic entity, and the abbess was its chief executive, responsible for its financial well-being and its interaction with the wider economy. So, the image of a medieval woman always financially helpless is far from the complete picture. From rural laborers selling their surplus produce to urban craftswomen running successful businesses, from noblewomen managing vast estates to abbesses overseeing large land holdings, medieval women were deeply embedded in the economy. They were earners, managers, property owners, and entrepreneurs, demonstrating a practical and sometimes substantial degree of economic independence that directly challenged the prevailing stereotype. Number 8. Medieval medicine and healthcare excluded women. The common belief that medieval medicine was solely the domain of male physicians, with women completely shut out from practice or knowledge of healthcare, is a historical distortion. In reality, women were central to healthcare at almost every level, from primary care providers in the home and community to highly skilled practitioners and even formally trained healers in certain contexts. Their roles were vital, often preferred, and certainly not marginalized until much later periods began to professionalize medicine in ways that excluded women. Considered the most ubiquitous form of healthcare care within the home and local community, women were the primary caregivers for their families. They understood herbal remedies, prepared poultices, managed fevers, and cared for the sick and elderly. This was not just rudimentary first aid, it involved a vast inherited knowledge of local flora and their medicinal properties, passed down through generations. A woman knew which herbs could soothe a cough, which could aid digestion, or which could reduce inflammation. This informal yet highly effective medical practice was the first and often only line of defense against illness for most people. These domestic healing skills were essential for survival in a world without modern pharmaceuticals. Beyond the household, midwives were indispensable figures in every community. Childbirth was an incredibly dangerous event in the Middle Ages, and the midwife's skill was paramount. They were the experts in obstetrics, assisting women through labor, often for hours or days, and providing care for both mother and infant afterward. Their knowledge encompassed not only practical birthing techniques, but also traditional remedies for pain relief, postnatal care, and recognizing complications. The midwifery was an exclusively female profession, highly respected and essential. They were often seen as wise women, their expertise honed through years of practical experience and specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Their presence was not just medical, but also spiritual and emotional, providing comfort and support during a vulnerable time. Women also worked as apothecaries, preparing and selling medicines. In towns, women were often involved in the production and sale of various compounds, including herbal concoctions, ointments, and balms. They might grind herbs, mix ingredients, and sell their wares at markets or from their homes. This required specific knowledge of ingredients, dosages, and preparation methods. Some women even ran shops dedicated to these goods, demonstrating their economic and practical engagement in the health industry. They were not just assistants, they were independent practitioners in their own right, providing vital services to the public. In urban areas and among the elite, there's evidence of women practicing more formalized medicine. While universities primarily trained men as physicians, some women, especially those in convents or wealthy households, had access to medical texts and pursued medical learning. Some noblewomen were known for their medical knowledge, treating not only their own families and servants, but also the poor in their communities. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, is a famous example. She wrote extensive treatises on natural history and medicine, detailing herbal remedies, human physiology, and holistic health. Her works Physica and Causae et Curae show a deep understanding of natural science and medical practice, demonstrating that women were not only patients but also sophisticated medical thinkers and writers. Her writings were widely read and influential, showing her significant contribution to medical thought. Convents often served as centers of healing and medical knowledge. Nuns cared for the sick within their communities and often opened their doors to the wider public, providing care, herbal remedies, and nursing services. They cultivated medicinal gardens where they grew herbs for their infirmaries. The abbesses and leading nuns often had advanced medical knowledge, acting as physicians and surgeons for their communities. They combined spiritual care with practical medical treatments, making convents important healthcare centers in the medieval landscape. The infirmary of a large convent could be a sophisticated medical facility for its time, staffed and managed by women. There are also instances of women being referred to as medici or physiciennes in various records, indicating that they were recognized as medical practitioners, not just domestic healers. While they might not have had university degrees, their practical skills and knowledge earned them respect and a clientele. Some women focus on specific areas of medicine like ophthalmology or the treatment of certain skin conditions, indicating a degree of specialization. The distinction between a formally trained male physician and a female healer was often blurred for the average person seeking care. What mattered was the ability to alleviate suffering. Even in surgical practices, which were often considered a rougher, more practical side of medicine, women sometimes played a role, especially in dealing with external injuries or setting bones. Their involvement was likely more prevalent in rural areas where formal medical help was scarce, relying on generations of passed down wisdom and practical experience. So, the portrayal of medieval healthcare as an exclusively male domain is inaccurate. Women were at the forefront of daily medical care in homes and communities, serving as indispensable midwives, practicing as apothecaries, and contributing significant written works to medical knowledge. They were healers, caregivers, and practitioners, their skills and contributions forming the bedrock of medieval health and well-being for the vast majority of the population. Number 7. Women had no role in religion beyond being nuns. The notion that medieval women's religious lives were confined solely to the cloister, limited to being nuns, severely understates their diverse and dynamic involvement in medieval Christianity. Women engaged with faith in myriad ways outside the convent walls, influencing religious thought, building churches, leading spiritual movements, and shaping lay piety in profound and often unexpected ways. Their religious agency extended far beyond the quiet life of prayer within a monastic community. Think about the powerful noblewomen who were patrons of the church. Queens, duchesses, and countesses used their vast wealth and influence to fund the construction of cathedrals, monasteries, and parish churches. They commissioned illuminated manuscripts, often religious texts, and donated precious relics and liturgical objects to religious institutions. These acts were not merely passive donations, they were strategic expressions of piety, power, and often political maneuvering. A woman like Matilda of Tuscany, a powerful 11th century ruler, actively supported Pope Gregory VII during the investiture controversy, demonstrating her profound religious conviction and her significant role in ecclesiastical politics. Her patronage was instrumental in shaping the religious landscape of her territories. These women were active participants in the physical and spiritual infrastructure of the church. And beyond grand patronage, women were also incredibly active in various forms of lay piety. This meant ordinary women, not formally ordained or cloistered, who engaged deeply with their faith. They participated in pilgrimages to holy sites, often undertaking arduous journeys to Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem. These pilgrimages were acts of penance, devotion, and sometimes social opportunity, allowing women to travel and experience the world. That women also joined confraternities and guilds, which often had strong religious components. These groups offered mutual support, organized charitable works, and sponsored religious festivals and processions. Through these organizations, women actively shaped community religious life and charitable efforts. Many women became hermits or anchorites. These were individuals who chose a life of extreme solitude and spiritual devotion, often walled into a small cell attached to a church. While physically isolated, they were far from cut off from religious influence. People sought their spiritual advice, their prayers were highly valued, and their ascetic lives served as powerful examples of piety. Julian of Norwich, a famous 14th century English anchorite, wrote profound theological texts, Revelations of Divine Love, which explored the nature of God's love and mercy. Her writings demonstrate a deep engagement with complex theological concepts, showing women as original religious thinkers, not just silent worshippers. Women were also instrumental in the development of mystical movements. The figures like Mechtilde of Magdeburg and Hadowich, both active in the 13th century, wrote passionate, poetic accounts of their visions and their personal experiences of divine love. Their mystical writings were incredibly influential, inspiring others and contributing to a rich tradition of spiritual literature. These women were direct channels of divine revelation for many, seen as holy figures whose insights deepened understanding of God. They were not operating within the official church hierarchy, but their spiritual authority was immense. The Beguines were another powerful example of women's religious life outside traditional monasticism. Emerging in the 12th century, particularly in the Low Countries, Beguines were laywomen who lived together in communities committed to poverty, chastity, and charitable work, but without taking permanent vows. They supported themselves through their labor, often in the textile industry, and dedicated their lives to prayer, nursing the sick, and teaching. They provided an alternative way for women to live a devout life without the strict enclosure of a convent, offering flexibility and personal autonomy. They were a vibrant and innovative spiritual movement led entirely by women, demonstrating a strong desire for personal piety and social service. Furthermore, women were crucial to the everyday functioning of parish churches. They attended Mass, participated in rituals, and contributed to the upkeep of the church through donations and volunteer work. They played roles in preparing the altar, washing linens, and decorating the church for feasts. Their active participation was essential for the vibrancy of local religious life. Women taught their children prayers and catechism, ensuring the continuity of Christian belief within the family, effectively serving as the first religious educators. Queens and royal women often played a pivotal role in promoting religious reforms or cults of particular saints. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, funded and supported various monastic orders and religious houses. Blanche of Castile, regent for her son Louis IX of France, was deeply devout and influenced the religious tone of the French court, promoting piety and Christian morality. These women used their positions to actively shape religious practices and beliefs at the highest levels of society. So, the idea that medieval women's religious options were limited to being a nun or nothing is a gross simplification. From powerful patrons commissioning cathedrals to humble pilgrims walking hundreds of miles, from visionary mystics writing profound theological texts to the active Beguine communities shaping urban piety, medieval women were dynamic, influential, and essential participants in every facet of the religious landscape, demonstrating a profound spiritual drive that found expression in countless forms. Number 6. Marriage was always a forced loveless transaction for women. The widespread belief that medieval marriages were universally bleak, cold, and entirely dictated by family economics or political gain, leaving no room for affection or choice for women, paints an incomplete and often misleading picture. While it is true that arranged marriages were the norm, especially among the nobility, the reality for many women was far more nuanced, encompassing elements of negotiation, personal consent, and, quite frequently, the development of genuine affection and love within the marital bond. The complexities of medieval marriage often defy such a simple, stark generalization. For the nobility and royalty, marriage was indeed a strategic alliance. A daughter might be betrothed at a young age to secure peace between feuding families, consolidate landholdings, or forge powerful political connections. Such unions were often decided by parents or guardians, with the woman's personal feelings often secondary to dynastic or political aims. For instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages to Louis VII of France and then Henry II of England were clearly politically driven. Yet, even in these high-stakes arrangements, a woman was not always a mere pawn. Her family would negotiate the dowry and dower rights fiercely to ensure her security and influence. A queen, or noblewoman, often brought significant lands and titles to a marriage, giving her considerable leverage and a voice in the affairs of her new household and realm. Sometimes a woman could even refuse a match, especially if it involved a significant social downgrade or an unacceptable personal situation, though such refusal often came with consequences. However, moving down the social ladder, especially into the burgeoning towns and among the peasantry, the picture shifts. While parental approval was still important, especially for property reasons, personal choice and mutual attraction played a much larger role. Many medieval law codes and church teachings emphasized the importance of consent. The canon law, the law of the church, stated that a marriage was only valid if both parties freely consented to it. Even if parents arranged a match, the actual marriage ceremony could not proceed without the explicit yes of both the bride and groom. There are documented cases of young women refusing a match they found unsuitable, and the church would typically uphold their right to do so. This didn't always mean a smooth path, but it did provide a legal basis for individual agency. Consider the role of the church in marriage. While it sometimes saw marriage as a sacrament for procreation and avoiding sin, it also promoted the idea of companionship and fidelity. The church's emphasis on mutual consent, even if often disregarded by powerful families, slowly seeped into societal consciousness. Preachers often spoke about the importance of harmony and love within marriage. Pastoral handbooks advised spouses to treat each other with respect and affection. This fostered an environment where, even if initial attraction was not the primary factor, affection and companionship could develop over time within the context of shared lives, duties, and child rearing. Evidence of affection and love within medieval marriages comes from various sources. Personal letters, while rare, sometimes reveal genuine fondness between spouses. Epitaphs on tombs occasionally speak of spouses as beloved or dear. Many medieval romances, while fictional, often explored themes of love and companionship within marriage, reflecting societal ideals and perhaps even realities for some. While courtly love often celebrated illicit, unfulfilled passion, it also sometimes served as a foil to highlight the real, if less dramatic, affection found in a stable marriage. For the peasantry, who formed the vast majority of the population, marriages were often arranged within the local community, considering practicalities like land and labor. However, young people often had more opportunities to interact and develop relationships than noble children. Village life, communal work, and local festivals provided settings for courtship. A peasant marriage might be about combining two plots of land or ensuring enough hands for the harvest, but it also involved living and working side by side for decades. Shared struggles, joys, and the raising of children inevitably fostered deep bonds of companionship, loyalty, and often love. The economic necessity of marriage did not preclude the development of affection. Furthermore, legal traditions sometimes provided women with surprising agency. In many Germanic legal systems, a woman's dowry was her property, and she had rights over it even if her husband managed it. This provided her with some financial security and a degree of bargaining power within the marriage. If a marriage was unhappy or abusive, annulment or separation, while difficult, was sometimes possible through the church courts, offering a potential escape route for women, even if it was rarely pursued due to social stigma and practical difficulties. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed considerable autonomy. A widow was legally a feme sole, or single woman, who could manage her own property, conduct business, and even choose to remarry or remain single. Many women chose to remain single after their husband's death, enjoying the independence that widowhood offered, especially if they had inherited a dower that provided them with economic security. This period of widowhood often represented the greatest freedom a woman might experience in her lifetime. So, while the institution of marriage in the Middle Ages was certainly different from modern conceptions, shaped by economic, social, and religious imperatives, it was not uniformly a loveless cage for women. Consent was, in theory, required by the church. The practicalities often led to the growth of companionship and affection. And for many women, particularly those lower down the social scale, or those who became widows, the reality included surprising levels of agency and opportunities for personal fulfillment within their marital lives. The narrative of universal oppression in marriage fails to capture the intricate tapestry of medieval human relationships. Number 5. Chivalry solely protected and revered women. The popular image of chivalry often presents it as a system purely dedicated to protecting, honoring, and placing women on a pedestal, seeing them as delicate creatures to be adored and served. This romanticized view, often drawn from later interpretations and fictional tales, overlooks the complex and often contradictory nature of chivalry itself. While it certainly contained elements of respect and courtesy towards women, particularly those of noble birth, it was fundamentally a male-centric code of conduct designed for male warriors, and it frequently objectified women, restricted their autonomy, and had little to do with protecting women outside the aristocratic class. Chivalry at its core was a code for knights. It focused on military prowess, loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, honor, and piety. The ideal knight was a fierce warrior, a loyal vassal, and a devout Christian. The protection of women was indeed one of the ideals, but it was often framed within the context of protecting one's own women wife, daughters, female relatives, or women of noble status as extensions of a man's honor and property. It rarely extended to protecting peasant women from the very knights who were supposed to embody the code. The realities of warfare often saw knights engage in acts of violence and pillage that harmed women of all social classes. The courtly love often associated with chivalry further complicates the picture. This literary tradition, popular in the 12th and 13th centuries, described a highly stylized and often unrequited love for a married noblewoman by a knight. While it placed the lady on a pedestal as an object of unattainable devotion and inspiration for the knight's deeds, it was largely a male fantasy. The lady herself was often passive, serving primarily as a muse for the knight's heroism and poetic expression. It was a game of aristocratic manners, where the woman's value was often in her ability to inspire and ennoble the man, rather than her own agency or well-being. It did not necessarily translate into real-world respect or protection for women in their daily lives. In fact, it often encouraged adultery, which was a sin and socially disruptive. Furthermore, the reverence for women in chivalry often came with inherent limitations. The ideal woman was often portrayed as chaste, silent, and obedient, embodying virtues that reinforce patriarchal societal norms. While she might be admired for her beauty or grace, this admiration was often tied to her fulfilling expected gender roles. Her value was often defined by her purity and her ability to produce legitimate heirs. This form of reverence, while outwardly positive, could be incredibly restrictive, limiting women's opportunities for independent action or public influence. The concept of chivalry did not apply equally to all women. A knight was expected to treat a noble woman with courtesy, but a peasant woman or a woman of lower social standing might receive little to no consideration under the code. The very knights who might compose poems to their ladies could easily exploit or disregard the rights of women beneath their social rank. This highlights the class-based nature of chivalric ideals and how they serve to reinforce social hierarchies rather than universal protection. The code was selective in its application. Moreover, chivalry often involved the display of masculine aggression and violence, particularly in tournaments and warfare. While these activities were presented as tests of skill and honor, they also highlighted a culture where male prowess and dominance were paramount. Women were often spectators at tournaments, their presence adding to the spectacle, but they were rarely participants in the physical contests. Their role was to admire and reward the male warriors, further reinforcing a gendered division of roles that placed men as active combatants and women as passive observers. The focus on a knight's honor often overshadowed the welfare of women. A knight might fight a duel to defend a woman's honor, but this was often more about protecting his own reputation or that of his lord rather than prioritizing the woman's personal safety or agency. If a woman was a pawn in a political dispute, chivalry did not necessarily prevent her from being imprisoned, married off against her will, or even killed if it served a larger male-dominated political objective. The concept of chivalry was intertwined with feudal obligations and male power dynamics, not purely humanitarian concerns. Even the romantic tales of knights rescuing damsels in distress, while captivating, served to reinforce the narrative of female helplessness and dependence on male intervention. These stories suggested that women were inherently vulnerable and needed saving, rather than highlighting their resilience or capability for self-preservation. While a knight might fight a dragon for a lady, this idealized scenario often obscured the real struggles and strengths of medieval women who managed their own lives and households without constant male intervention. In conclusion, while chivalry certainly introduced concepts of courtesy and idealized admiration for women into medieval aristocratic culture, it was far from a universal or consistently applied code of protection. It was primarily a male-authored and male-centric code for warriors, often serving to reinforce social hierarchies, regulate male behavior among themselves, and sometimes to objectify women within specific aristocratic contexts. The romanticized image of chivalry often fails to acknowledge its limitations, its inherent contradictions, and its often detrimental impact on women's autonomy and safety across the broader social spectrum. Number 4. All medieval women were illiterate and uneducated. The pervasive image of medieval women as universally uneducated, confined to a life devoid of books and learning, is a deeply flawed stereotype. While formal schooling was certainly not as widespread as it is today, and literacy rates varied greatly by social class and region, countless medieval women accessed education, engaged with texts, and even contributed significantly to intellectual life, challenging the narrow perception of their minds as empty vessels. Their learning often took diverse forms, extending far beyond the traditional classroom. Consider the aristocratic women. Noble women were frequently educated, often by tutors within their own households or in convents. They learned to read and write, primarily in Latin and often in vernacular languages as well, such as French, English, or German. This literacy was not just for pleasure, it was essential for managing vast estates, overseeing household accounts, corresponding with other noble families, and sometimes even for diplomatic purposes. A woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine was renowned for her intelligence and patronage of arts and letters, demonstrating a sophisticated education. Another example is Duoda, a 9th century Carolingian noblewoman who wrote a moral handbook, the Liber Manualis, for her son, revealing a deep familiarity with biblical texts, classical authors, and theological concepts. Her work shows that educated women could be profound thinkers and writers. Convents were centers of learning for women. Young noble and wealthy girls were sent to convents not just for spiritual training, but also for a comprehensive education that included reading, writing, Latin, arithmetic, music, and sometimes even medicine or natural philosophy. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen were not only spiritual leaders, but also celebrated scholars, composers, and natural scientists whose works were widely read and respected. Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote plays, poems, and histories, consciously emulating classical authors like Terence. These women were intellectuals who contributed original works to medieval literature and thought, demonstrating high levels of education and intellectual curiosity. Even outside the nobility and convents, education existed for women, particularly in urban areas. And daughters of wealthy merchants and artisans often received an education because literacy was a practical necessity for business. They learned to read and write to help manage account books, keep inventories, and handle correspondence related to their family's trade. The guilds sometimes provided educational opportunities for their members' children, including daughters. For example, in Florentine merchant families, daughters were often taught basic literacy and numeracy to assist in the family business, making them active economic participants, not just passive household members. While formal universities were largely closed to women, this did not mean a complete absence of higher learning. Some women, particularly those involved in medicine, like Trotula of Salerno in the 11th century, were associated with medical schools or traditions. Although her exact identity is debated, the texts attributed to her demonstrate sophisticated medical knowledge and suggest that women could participate in advanced medical discourse and practice. Women were also active as copyists and illuminators in scriptoria, often in convents, which required high levels of literacy and artistic skill. They played a direct role in the production and preservation of knowledge. The concept of literacy itself was broader in the Middle Ages. Not everyone needed to read and write in the modern sense. Oral culture was paramount, and knowledge was transmitted through storytelling, sermons, and visual art. However, even within this context, women engaged with religious texts, often through devotional books or psalters. These books, sometimes beautifully illuminated, were used for private prayer and meditation. While some might have only recognized key phrases or images, others learned to read these texts independently, deepening their personal piety and understanding of theology. The very existence of such books for private female devotion indicates an expectation of literacy or at least a desire to engage with written spirituality. Furthermore, medieval women learned valuable skills beyond formal academic subjects. They mastered complex crafts like weaving, embroidery, lace making, and brewing, often within a guild structure that involved apprenticeship and technical training. These were not just domestic chores, but often highly skilled professions that required precision, artistic talent, and sometimes mathematical understanding. While not book learning, this vocational education was rigorous and essential, providing women with economic independence and social standing. The idea that medieval women were entirely uneducated is a myth that ignores the varied forms of learning that existed. From noblewomen managing empires with their literacy, to nuns composing influential works of philosophy and literature, to urban women keeping their families' business accounts, and rural women transmitting vital knowledge of herbal remedies, medieval women were active participants in the intellectual and practical dissemination of knowledge. Their education might not always fit modern definitions, but it was significant, purposeful, and often deeply enriching. Number 3, medieval women had no legal rights. The persistent myth that medieval women were entirely devoid of legal rights, existing solely as perpetual minors under the absolute authority of fathers or husbands, is a vast oversimplification. While it is true that medieval legal systems were largely patriarchal and varied significantly across regions and time periods, women possessed a surprising array of legal capacities. They could own property, engage in contracts, sue and be sued, inherit, and even represent themselves in court, demonstrating a level of legal agency that often goes unrecognized. Let's begin with property rights. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly under English common law, a woman had the right to own and inherit property. If a woman was a femimsel, meaning single or widowed, She had full legal capacity to manage her own property, enter into contracts, and conduct business independently. She could buy, sell, or lease land, and her actions in these matters were legally binding. This was a critical aspect of independence for single and widowed women. A widow, for example, would often inherit a dower, typically one-third of her deceased husband's estate, which was hers to use and manage for the rest of her life. This dower was a recognized legal right, not a charitable provision, and provided many widows with economic and legal autonomy. Even married women, though legally considered feme covert covered by their husband's legal identity, still retained some property rights. Her appara, or peculium, which was property she brought into the marriage as dowry or acquired independently, often remained her own, though her husband might manage it. In some towns, particularly those with a vibrant mercantile economy, customs arose that granted married women the status of feme sole trader. This allowed them to conduct business independently of their husbands, enter into contracts, incur debts, and sue or be sued in their own name in matters related to their trade. This was crucial for women running shops, selling goods, or engaging in various crafts, providing them with essential legal autonomy in the economic sphere. For example, in London, custom allowed married women to trade independently, meaning they could engage in commercial activity without their husband's explicit permission or involvement, a significant legal empowerment. Women could also make wills and bequeath their property. A single or widowed woman had full testamentary freedom to dispose of her property as she wished, including land, chattels, and money. Even married women, with their husband's consent or sometimes without it for certain types of property, could make wills, allowing them to provide for their children, relatives, or charitable causes. This right to dispose of property after death was a powerful legal tool, enabling women to exert influence even beyond their lifetimes. In legal disputes, women were not voiceless. They could initiate lawsuits, defend themselves against accusations, and appear as witnesses in court. Records show women prosecuting cases of debt, property disputes, slander, and even violent crimes. They could appoint attorneys to represent them, or they could plead their own cases, demonstrating their understanding of legal procedures and their determination to seek justice. While women might face disadvantages in a male-dominated legal system, their right to access it was fundamental. For instance, women in English common law courts actively pursued and defended their rights concerning land and goods, sometimes successfully. The medieval church also played a significant role in women's legal lives. Canon law, the law of the church, had jurisdiction over matters such as marriage, divorce, or annulment, and wills. A woman could bring a case before a church court to seek an annulment of an unwanted marriage, to enforce promises of marriage, or to resolve disputes over dowry. The church's emphasis on mutual consent in marriage, even if often disregarded by families, provided women with a legal basis to refuse a forced union, though this was often challenging in practice. They could also testify in ecclesiastical courts, and their testimony was considered valid. Even in criminal law, women were recognized as legal individuals. They could be accused of crimes, tried, and punished according to the law. While punishments might vary based on gender or social status, women were not simply subsumed under their husband's legal responsibility for criminal acts. They were held individually accountable for their own actions. It is true that women faced limitations. They could not typically hold public office, serve on juries, or become judges in most secular courts. Their legal status often changed upon marriage, with the husband gaining significant control over their property and person. But these limitations do not negate the significant legal capacities that women did possess. The notion of total legal powerlessness is far from the reality, which was much more varied and complex. Legal rights for women were often tied to their marital status and social class, but they were certainly not non-existent. So, the narrative of medieval women having no legal rights is profoundly misleading. While their rights were not equivalent to modern ones and varied by region, social status, and marital status, medieval women were legally recognized individuals who could own property, manage businesses, engage in contracts, sue and be sued, and pursue justice in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. Their legal agency was a crucial aspect of their lives, allowing them to navigate their world with a degree of autonomy and to protect their interests. Number 2. Women were confined to the home and domestic duties. The enduring image of medieval women perpetually confined within the walls of their homes, their lives solely dictated by domestic chores like cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, is a vastly inaccurate simplification. While managing a household was certainly a central aspect of many women's lives, a thorough look at historical evidence reveals a vibrant landscape of women working in virtually every sector of medieval society, from the fields to the bustling markets, from skilled crafts to positions of power. Their contributions extended far beyond the domestic sphere, directly impacting the economy, the community, and even political life. Let's journey to the countryside, where the vast majority of medieval people lived. Peasant women were indispensable to agricultural life. They worked alongside men in the fields, planting seeds, weeding crops, and participating in the arduous tasks of harvest. They gathered firewood, managed livestock, milked cows, and produced cheese and butter. Their labor was not merely supplementary, it was fundamental to the survival and productivity of the rural household. The division of labor was often blurred, with women taking on whatever tasks were necessary for the family's sustenance and income. They were not confined to the cottage, but were active participants in the demanding outdoor labor that fed the entire society. Now, imagine the vibrant life of a medieval town. Women were integral to the urban economy. They were craftswomen, running shops, and engaging in trade. Women were active in the textile industry, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and working as embroiderers. These were highly skilled professions, often organized into guilds, where women earned their own wages and contributed significantly to urban wealth. Women were also common brewers, bakers, candle makers, and innkeepers. For example, records from medieval London show numerous women operating taverns and brewing ale. In Paris, women had their own guilds for specific crafts like silk weaving, illustrating their professional autonomy and skill. They managed apprentices, dealt with customers, and handled accounts, demonstrating business acumen far beyond simple domesticity. Consider the role of women in the burgeoning merchant class. While large-scale international trade was often dominated by men, many women ran smaller retail businesses. They sold goods in markets, from fresh produce and poultry to textiles and ready-made clothing. They might travel to neighboring towns for fairs, buying and selling goods. The widows, in particular, often took over their deceased husbands' businesses, managing complex commercial ventures and maintaining trade networks. These were not minor ventures, they were vital parts of the local economy, managed independently by women. Even within the context of the noble household, which was often vast and complex, noble women were far from idle domestic figures. They were managers of large estates, overseeing numerous servants, financial accounts, and the production of goods necessary for the household. They might supervise agricultural operations, manage tenants, and handle legal matters related to their lands. For example, a noblewoman might be responsible for the household's food supply, which involved managing barns, dairies, and gardens, as well as supervising the preparation of elaborate meals for dozens of people. When their husbands were away on crusade or war, noblewomen frequently acted as regents, governing their lordships, dispensing justice, and even leading defensive efforts. Blanche of Castile, regent of France for her son Louis IX, famously defended the kingdom against rebellious barons and internal strife, showcasing immense political and administrative skill far beyond the confines of a simple home. This religious life also offered women roles outside domesticity. Nuns and convents engaged in a variety of non-domestic activities. They copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, managed large estates, ran schools, and provided healthcare and infirmaries open to the public. Abbesses were powerful figures, often landowners, who administered their communities as complex organizations engaging with secular lords, popes, and kings. Their lives were dedicated to spiritual and intellectual pursuits and the practical management of a religious institution, a far cry from being confined to a household kitchen. Even women who did focus on domestic work often had broader responsibilities. The production of clothes, for instance, involved not just sewing, but also spinning, weaving, and dyeing, which were time-consuming and often done outside the home in specialized workshops or as part of a communal effort. Food preparation was often a communal activity, especially for large festivals or harvests. Domestic work was often interwoven with broader economic and community functions, blurring the lines between private and public spheres. So, the idea that medieval women were universally confined to purely domestic roles is a modern misinterpretation. From the fields and farms to the workshops and markets, from royal courts to powerful convents, medieval women were active, indispensable participants in every facet of economic, social, and political life. Their labor and skills were essential for the functioning of society, demonstrating a dynamism and public presence that utterly shatters the myth of their domestic confinement. Number 1. Women were universally oppressed and powerless. The narrative of medieval women as uniformly oppressed, completely devoid of power or agency, and living under the total domination of men is a pervasive but deeply inaccurate generalization. While medieval society was undeniably patriarchal and women certainly faced significant limitations and inequalities, this broad brushstroke hides a far more complex reality. Women from different social classes in various regions and at different times within the Middle Ages wielded surprising amounts of power, influence, and autonomy, often challenging the very structures that sought to confine them. Their lives were filled with resilience, strategic maneuvering, and sometimes outright authority. Consider the immense power wielded by queens and noblewomen. Queens were not just passive consorts, they were often powerful political figures, acting as regents for underage sons, managing royal treasuries, conducting diplomacy, and even leading armies. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous women of the Middle Ages, was a duchess in her own right, controlling vast territories, and later, as Queen of France and then England, she was a central player in European politics for decades. She led a contingent on crusade, sponsored literary figures, and even organized a rebellion against her husband, Henry II. Her life demonstrates incredible political acumen and authority. Blanche of Castile, as regent for her son Louis IX, effectively ruled France for many years, securing its borders, suppressing rebellions, and ensuring the stability of the kingdom. These women were not exceptions, but powerful examples of royal female leadership. Noblewomen, even below the royal level, frequently managed large estates in their husband's absence, overseeing finances, legal disputes, and the well-being of numerous tenants and vassals. They held court, dispensed justice, and commanded the loyalty of their households. Their roles as chatelains were crucial for the functioning of the feudal system. They were the economic and administrative backbone of their lordships, especially when their male relatives were away fighting or on pilgrimage. This administrative power translated directly into social and political influence within their local regions. In the religious sphere, abbesses held significant power. They were spiritual leaders, but also powerful landowners who managed vast monastic estates, sometimes controlling more land and resources than many secular lords. They governed large communities of nuns, often including women from aristocratic families, and interacted directly with popes, kings, and bishops as powerful equals. Hildegard of Bingen, an abbess in the 12th century, was not only a renowned visionary and composer, but also a political advisor to emperors and popes, engaging in extensive correspondence with the powerful men of her era. Her influence extended far beyond her convent walls. Moving to the urban centers, women held economic power and social standing in surprising ways. As discussed, defamed sole traders, whether single or married women, could run their own businesses, enter into contracts, and manage their own finances independently. Women were often members of guilds, sometimes in leadership positions, controlling access to trades like brewing, baking, and textile production. They owned property, paid taxes, and participated in the economic life of their towns. This economic agency provided a foundation for a degree of social and personal autonomy, allowing them to shape their own lives and contribute to their communities. Even among the peasantry, who formed the vast majority of the population, women had agency within their households and communities. While their lives were often physically demanding, they held critical roles in agricultural production and household management, their labor being indispensable. They managed small surpluses from their gardens or animals, giving them some control over family resources. They were also active in local village life, participating in communal gatherings, festivals, and informal social networks where female influence and opinion held weight. Their informal power in the community, through gossip, networking, and reputation, was often significant. Legal systems, while patriarchal, were not monolithic in their oppression of women. As discussed, women had property rights, the right to inherit, and the ability to sue and be sued in many regions. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed considerable legal and economic independence, managing inherited property and sometimes choosing to remain single and autonomous rather than remarry. This period of widowhood could be a time of significant freedom and power for women. Moreover, personal relationships often provided avenues for influence. Women, even within marriage, could exert influence over their husbands, sons, and other male relatives through persuasion, affection, and familial bonds. The role of a mother, for instance, often came with significant moral authority and influence over her children, including powerful sons. Examples like Monica, the mother of St. Augustine, show how a woman's influence could shape the intellectual and spiritual path of a powerful male figure. The narrative of universal female powerlessness overlooks the varied experiences of medieval women and their remarkable ability to navigate and sometimes subvert the patriarchal structures of their time. From ruling queens and powerful abbesses to independent craftswomen and resilient peasant laborers, medieval women were active, influential, and often powerful agents in their own lives and in the wider world, constantly challenging the simplistic idea of total oppression.